Perfect. Good afternoon. It's afternoon where I am. Thank you all for joining us for this report dissemination webinar. My name is Bobina Zulfa, and I'm a data and digital rights researcher with Pollicy. I will be the moderator for the session. Thank you all for joining us. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. I think we're ready to get started. I think all our panelists are here. Amos is here, so is Bridget, so is Gillian. Okay, perfect. All right. I'll get to it. Okay. All right, so session is meant to be about 90 minutes, and so we'll try and do everything within the time we have. I think it's just enough time. All our speakers are here, and so I think we'll be able to do everything just within good time and call it a day. So people are still greeting. All right, just maybe some housekeeping rules. If you do, want to ask any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat as we go along. If you do have any directed towards our panelists, our discussants, please leave them in the chat. We'll be seeing all of them and responding to them, I guess, after they're done. And we also have a Q&A session at the end. But the flow of the session is going to be, we're going to have Mr. Amos Mpungu from the Ministry of ICT here in Uganda, who is going to give an opening address, and then we'll get into the report dissemination findings, just a sharing of the findings very quickly from the lead researcher, Amba Sinha, and then we will have our panelists join us for 10 minutes per speaker. So we'll have Bridget first from Bridget Boache from the Tony Blair Institute, and then we'll have Kito Shilongo from the Mozilla Foundation, and then we'll have Gillian Dowie from IDRC close off with a closing address, and then we'll have a little Q&A session, and then that'll be it. Okay, so I think I will just give a brief overview about this, and then I can hand it over to Amos. All right. If you're joining us, just joining us, I see a number of people just coming in. You're welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. It's an honor for, to have you be a part of us for this conversation. So this webinar is a dissemination for two of our reports that we've been working on at Pollicy with support from IDRC and as part of the larger AI4D program in CEDA. And so it's largely titled Towards Afro-feminist AI, which speaks to, I'd say, the underlying objectives of the program, of the project rather. So I guess a number of questions stand out from the get-go, which is one, why Afro-feminist AI? And I'll say we take Pollicy, for starters, is a feminist collective. I think a number of the colleagues on the call are already aware of that, but some people may not know. And so we're a feminist collective, and we work at the intersection of data, tech, and society. And so we look at our societies and how they're, interacting with emerging technologies, how they're being impacted, and come up with a number of recommendations. And for example, with this particular handbook, just practices and guides on how technology and data can more suitably and equitably serve our communities, particularly within the African context, but also within the global South as a whole, and any other part of the globe really where it's applicable. And so from the inception of this project, I think IDRC was very keen on us, or the AI4D program was keen on us bringing our expertise from our previous work that we had done with women in AI, our research we had done previously, the 3-part reports, and then taking that and using it to inform how a regulation can best impact how African women are benefiting from AI technologies as they're being developed and adopted across the continent. And so the Afro-feminist element comes in for our work, we were very much informed by Dr. Sylvia Tamale's work, who authored the book Decolonization and Afrofeminism. And so we take on from her thinking the perspective that African women are in a place to recreate and come up with creative frameworks of inquiry and new ways of knowing, and therefore come up with new sets of knowledge. So for example, with this particular product, the handbook, to inform just different parts of our society. So this moves from, for example, the idea of deconstruction, where we look at systems of ideality that have for long been established as systems of reality, and debunking them, and move to a new place of reasserting our self-determination, our moving away from systems of domination. And that is through these new and fresh creative frameworks of inquiry and knowledge production. And so that is the angle that Afrofeminism brings to the work that we've been doing with this research, which is at the intersection of AI, African women, and governance. And so the three are sort of tied together in that way. And so there is the background paper, VELAI, which stands for Visions of Emancipatory Liberatory AI. We did the conceptualization of this with a colleague called Feva, who was with us at the time. And I think the idea was coming from really the idea that there has been, just a lot of research that's been done over the last, especially 2 years, that's showing all these, just not the benefits alone, but also the harms that are coming along with AI systems as they're being, deployed and developed across the continent, or also just globally everywhere. And I think there is these very broad terms that are used. For example, we'll hear terms like, "Oh, these technologies are to the benefit of these communities in such and such a way." And so for us, the idea of emancipatory and liberatory was to speak to that angle of what does benefit mean when we see that in fact a number of structural inequities are being brought into play with these technologies as they're becoming a part of our lives, as our societies are increasingly datafying, even here on the continent, where of course there is the argument of access and digital rights. How do those two coexist in a place where access would be a privilege? But just that is of course something that's existent. But moving away from that conversation is then how do we realize AI systems that indeed will reassert the liberation, people to have free lives of agency, lives of self-determination. And so those are a lot of the issues that we explore within. So the background paper, VELAI, like I said, just goes over just a number of case scenarios, a broader landscape of the intersection of gender, data, gender, AI, and of course data is a part of that, and governance. And then to the handbook then brings in a number of draft principles that speak to what we call broadly within the VELAI report, what we broadly term as the problem and the solution. And
Obina,
it establishes more concrete
Obina, I'm so
ways
sorry
of thinking around these issues. I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. I would like to request Bata to mute himself. He's typing away. We're trying to reach him. I'm so sorry.
No worries. Okay.
But can you hear us?
Yes, I can, but it's actually coming from Bobina's mic.
Oh,
Really?
Yeah. We are hearing a clicking sound. We thought someone was typing on their laptop. Sorry for that.
I don't think that's me.
Just please go on.
Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't realize that was coming from me. Anyways, very, very broadly, that's what these projects are looking to. And so in the broadest, scheme of just beyond just these creative frameworks of inquiry and coming up with new ways of knowing, we hope that this piece of work does contribute to, we're seeing a number of principles coming up globally all over, really different parts of the world in terms of soft laws and recommendations. We know like the OECD principles or the UNESCO ethical principles, just a number of frameworks that are coming up that do not very specifically, center the realities of African women. And these two pieces of work work to, in a very major way, correct this historical exclusion in a way of the experiences and the realities of this demographic within the global AI discourse, and in a way that is very that gives a very a way forward, with the handbook. And so that's just very broadly about these two pieces of work, and we'll have them up on our website after this launch. And so please feel free to go and dive into them and leave us all your feedback, what you think about them. Would love to engage with all of you past this. And yeah, so that's a little about this Towards Afro-feminist AI piece of work. And I think now I will let Amos come in and share his remarks with us. Amos, you're most welcome.
Thank you, Bobina. I hope I'm audible enough. So, thank you for having me. I just want to take a few minutes to give just a highlight of what government thinks, or what government thinks of government's perspective on AI and governance. Greetings from the PS, Means of ICT. All stakeholders present, the Executive Director, Pollicy. It's indeed a pleasure to be here for this particular launch of the report Towards Afro-feminist AI. I think I got the report title right. I just wish it was just Towards AI or something like that. But I know Pollicy is quite very strong on its feminist values. Yeah. Anyway, as a ministry, we lead the digital transformation program, and therefore that means we actually are responsible for digital transformation within the country. But also we know that once we go digital, that means we're digitizing the systems, we are digitizing our processes. We're going to be not only collecting, but generating a lot of data, most especially for these administrative systems. And we're also cognizant of the fact that the primary person, or the primary data subject is still an individual. I also notice that the AI systems we are talking about, actually, the composition, if we are talking about DNA of AI, it is about data. These systems are trained on the data that we generate, or they can pick from the systems. So it is quite important for us as a ministry, which is responsible for regulation, to make sure that whatever we try, while we are pushing this agenda of achieving AI or having AI and utilize or digitizing the economy, we actually can keep our primary data subject as safe as possible. So we have concerns, definitely thinking around, researching around how AI can be used responsibly. Okay. We know that, yeah, technology is quite important. It boosts a lot of progress and innovation. And some of the systems we're already using. My regular friend these days, before I leave office, in most cases, I first go to Google Maps just to find out which of the routes I can use to get me to my home as fast as possible, or whichever destination as fast as possible. Because it has already mapped the roads and already looking at the traffic patterns. That is quick AI that is quite beneficial. But on the other hand, we also know that these can have negative connotations around the abuse of the data and fundamental rights and freedom, or abuse of fundamental rights and freedom. So as government, we are trying to see how do we actually promote the use of such technologies. but within a responsible and also protective manner. So within our different frameworks, we actually do try to recognize that these are actually technologies that exist, but we also want to see how best we can promote them. So it is against this background that we've always tried to strike a balance between mitigating the risks and making full use of the advantages that AI can offer, for example. So our focus right now is trying to have what we can call a transparent and clearly defined legal and ethical framework that can be respected by all citizens, but also respected by the technology that we produce, as well as protecting the humans who are the source of the data and the services that are consumed or produced out of AI. A bit of research has been done, and here what we've tried to come out with, or what has come out is, first of all, because it is technology and it's usually self-governed, we need to find a way of, we need to understand how we can make it a bit of, we can develop what we can call a democratic governance and of artificial intelligence, where we are not so, the regulation is not constraining, but also doesn't give a lot of free way to end up into abuse or discrimination. We also want to be able to understand and see how can AI impact or be used responsibly within the medical, the legal. What are the challenges that come out in adoption of AI? So we're looking at those legal aspects and the responsibilities around such issues. Generally, our research has led us to basically, I think we have about 4 universally accepted core principles, because what we are trying to do is we're trying to develop a legal framework or regulatory framework that is also internationally recognized, considering the fact that we also do belong to a number of regional bodies. So we ratify a number of conventions, the East African Community, the African Union. But then again, we are dealing with technologies that do not actually respect boundaries in terms of physical boundaries. So we also want to have a framework that is universally accepted, that can be used even when someone is dealing with data subjects from Uganda, but dealing with that data from a different jurisdiction. So therefore, what we are looking for, we have about 5 core principles that we think we should build our AI framework on, and that is transparency, which also includes accessibility. In other words, a framework that allows transparency in terms of how the systems work, but also not excluding any particular race, and not excluding any particular definition of gender. Then a framework that allows justice and fairness, human responsibility for the decisions that are made out of AI, because yes, it's artificial intelligence, but there is a reason that's why it's called artificial intelligence, because it's basically, there is a natural person building that intelligence based on what a natural person does. So that means if you are to build a system and use it, then you should be responsible for the decisions that come out. Okay, a human should be able to take the responsibility of the decisions that come out of the use of an AI technology. Then we're also looking at safety and security, and finally, privacy and data protection. As I had said earlier, artificial intelligence or systems and technologies are only acceptable. The DNA is data. So we need to be able to protect the data, because we have a data subject who is a human being that needs their privacy. So we need to be able to protect not only the data, but the data subject as well. And that is what we are trying to look at in terms of building an AI ethical framework that can help us legally and responsibly utilize AI within the country. So and therefore, as a ministry, we are actually quite excited when we see such reports coming up that already try to shine a light into what the AI ecosystem would look like. We appreciate very much, by the way, the efforts Pollicy makes, because Pollicy with a double L, the efforts Pollicy makes in terms of research, because in most cases, most of this research also informs government policy. And this is a report, I think, I have to be honest, I haven't looked at it fully, but I want to believe that once I get into looking at it, I'm going to be able to pick a lot of insights in terms of that can actually inform the AI ethical framework that we are trying to develop. As I mentioned, some of these AI as a principle, AI as a technology is already recognized in most of the strategic documents, the national data strategy, the digital transformation roadmap, and all these, even the national 4IRI strategy, the fourth industrialization strategy. And we now just trying to look into, yes, we've acknowledged that these exist, we would want to utilize them, but how do we utilize them responsibly in a healthy manner that is protective of our citizens and also respects the privacy and human rights of everyone who is involved. Yeah. And as in a nutshell, that is what we are looking for, or that's what we are trying to do. So maybe something that I want to, as a summary, what basically we want to, these are the three issues that we try to keep in mind as we try to work with AI. The first is adopting a holistic approach, basically looking at the entire life cycle of AI-based systems, right from the design phase, the application, and then the effects of consequences. Second, being the importance of the multi-stakeholder approach. And I appreciate the fact that Pollicy is bringing stakeholders on board. I did not know how informed the research was in terms of the stakeholder engagement, but I've participated in some of the policy researches, and usually you usually take a bit of time to engage as many stakeholders as possible. So I want to believe that the report is actually well informed by a multi-stakeholder approach. In other words, a number of stakeholders have been were actually engaged in developing of this. And the last one is the striking of balance between regulation and technology development. As I mentioned, we want to make sure that we do not over-regulate, which might kill our innovation. But on the other hand, we also want to see that the regulation reduces the risk of overstepping those red lines or the legal lines. Ladies and gentlemen, that is briefly what government is doing in terms of AI. And I want to thank you once again for welcoming the ministry, or inviting the ministry to be part of this, and want to wish you fruitful deliberations moving forward. I thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Amos. Thank you very much for sharing what you're up to in terms of coming up with that ethical roadmap and just everything that's happening on your end as the Ministry of ICT. Really, really interesting to hear about a number of things you've touched on, especially, you know, when you speak to how do you keep the primary user safe? I think there's a lot of issues where we're interesting ourselves in with this report, especially when it comes to looking particularly at the people who are living at the margins of society. You touch on, you know, responsible innovation and how that can be balanced out with, you know, ethical development. Just really a number of interesting issues that I think are just part and parcel of the global, not just even Ugandan or African AI conversation discourse as a whole. So really, it's been a pleasure to have you join us and give that opening address, Amos. Really, really thank you. So I think now we will move over to our session of the panel session of not the panel session. We'll move over to the paper presentation and findings. I think Amber, should I go first? You want to go first?
Why don't you go first, Bobina, and I'll join after you.
Okay, sounds good. For those that did join us earlier, I was just touching on a number of issues that we go over in the reports, both VELAI and the handbook. But I think from my presentation, I'll mostly just concentrate on VELAI. So like I was sharing, VELAI, which is Visions of Emancipatory Liberatory AI, is a scoping in a sense of what the landscape looks like when it comes to adoption and development of AI technologies in relationship to how African women particularly are engaging with these technologies or how they're impacting with their lives. And then we did have at the back of our minds that the end product of this was coming up with regulatory practices and principles to guide policymakers, but also civil society in their examination of these technologies as they were being adopted in different communities across the continent. So the work is, in a sense, very much rooted within the African context, although, of course, I do believe it's applicable to, much of the global south, really, but even any other parts of the globe in relation to persons that are living at the margins of society. So like I was sharing earlier, we did, from the get-go, we did find that a lot of the research that was being done and, showing the benefits that these technologies pose for the continent, but also the harms. And so from, for example, our work in the Women in AI series that we've done over the last few years at Pollicy, it did show just a number of threats and opportunities and this space, the AI ecosystem presented for the continent as a whole. And so we wanted to step in and very accurately, in just very tangible, in a sense, in very tangible terms, scope out the things that we felt were most relevant, the elements we felt were most relevant to this discussion. And so that's how VELAI, in a sense, is presented at the intersection of AI, gender, and governance. And so we look at issues, for example, to do with data. And so we have the first part, which we broadly call the problem. And so here we lay out what, what we see as a number of, using case scenarios, a number of just issues that we think are cross-cutting when it comes to the use of AI technologies across the continent, whether it's chatbots, whether it's credit scoring systems, just basically any and every AI systems that are being used anywhere, whether it be in the public sector or in the private sector. And even for us, particularly here on the continent, where the AI ecosystem is just growing, is just burgeoning, we did want to give that sort of broad layout of what we looked at as the problem. And then on the other hand, we did offer broadly again what we called the solution. And so here we did explore a number of issues. I mean, a number of ways forward for, a regulator to think about, or for us, a person in civil society to think about. For example, intersectionally defining harm, moving away from the approach where we look at a universal user where there's no such thing, et cetera, et cetera. But really, in a nutshell, I think what we're going for is very much steeping ourselves into the use of the Afro-feminist lens as a new approach for thinking about how these systems can be on the very, in the end, or just on the further end, regulated, but just across just the entire pipeline from development or ideation or development of these systems everywhere, and for whatever use cases, whether, because especially here on the continent, we see a lot of domain-specific AI coming up, whether it's for agriculture or for health, as these systems are being developed and the communities where they're being, whether they're being brought upon these communities or the communities are bringing these systems upon themselves. do these systems bring them more, do they emancipate them in a sense, or do they, in a sense, squash their agency, their autonomy, their decision autonomy, et cetera, et cetera. And so just very broadly, I'd say that that's what VELAI explores in just very long format with a number of case studies, and that touches on just so many things. And once the report is up and you've had a read, I think that will be something you'll be able to see on your own. Otherwise, really, it was very much also, I'll just say, as I conclude, that this also was just looking at the AI and big data ecosystem as is today, and just the new forms of domination and discrimination it brings about, particularly for, again, for example, African women, where maybe there is already issues of access. I did talk about the juxtaposition earlier of access and digital rights, but moving on to so many other issues of of exclusion and discrimination, et cetera, and how do we move over from that place to a place of more liberation, of greater emancipation, with these systems being part and parcel of our lives as our system, as our countries, our societies increasingly datafy. So I'll be very happy to have a longer chat with anyone who's interested post this call, but that's very briefly what you find in the VELAI report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bobina. Let me jump in at that point with that sort of context behind the motivations behind this research that we have done. So let me state very, very briefly that this report exists within the broader context for multiple, different sort of movements happening within the continent as well as globally. Globally, there is more and more conversation about the need to regulate AI, and we are now kind of with AI Act in the US and other kind of competing governance mechanisms. We are looking at the brass tacks of what that governance might look like, and that very much remains an open question at this point. Parallelly, what we're seeing in the continent is also, increasing adoption of the fourth industrial revolution, as well as automated technologies and AI within that. And in a lot of places, we also see automated technologies, digital technologies replacing other forms of analog services that we had before that. And then parallelly, what we're also seeing, like, in the keynote Amos referred to, is multiple regulatory efforts coming from within nation states in Africa, as well as the African Union, to look at the broader issue of the need for governance and regulation of data and AI, and most notably the African Union data policy and framework. So within that context, we very clearly identified the need for an Afro-feminist approach to AI governance in Africa. And when we say that, in terms of what we mean by Afrofeminism, there are a few values of Afrofeminism that we find most relevant and pertinent to application in the governance and regulation of AI. The first being the need to achieve some harmony between individual and collective data rights. And more the global conversation around data is about individual rights, but drawing from the works of scholars like Sylvia Tamale that Bobina mentioned earlier, we do need to look at the Ubuntu tradition in Africa. We need to look at prior processes such as the Grikaka process, juxtaposed with the ICTR process, and see how collective rights over data can be operationalized. Then the second idea is very much core to Afrofeminism, the idea to confront AI exploitation. The way the data economy is structured, it's entrenched with a lot of power asymmetries. which are only getting amplified and exacerbated every day. So Afro-feminist AI would build on the need to redistribute power over data in a manner that is fair and equitable to all actors. Then we need to visibilize workers. When we do look at most of the front-end AI development, it is actually supported by a lot of ghost workers, often from the South, who work as informal short-term labor in a range of tasks, including things like data labeling, through an evolving gig economy. So there's need to regulate that, to illuminate, recognize, and protect the workers from exploitative practices. And the final principle would be to center decisional autonomy. How do we look at the datafication and the extractive information capitalism around it that stifles human dignity, and try to reverse that trend through this approach? So our Afro-feminist playbook for regulating AI looks at three forms of regulation. There's primary regulation, which is implemented by the state through laws, regulations, and rules. Then there's self-regulation, which is regulatory behavior that we see emerging within the private sector, within industry groups, but also within a specific company, such as the adoption of various ethical AI principles by companies such as Microsoft, Google, IBM, etc. And then finally, co-regulation, which is basically a kind of mix of the two approaches, where you have a kind of a coordination between state and non-state actors. You leave discretionary power for non-state regulation, but with a kind of state supervision or blessing of a framework by the state. Now, in order to kind of arrive at any holistic understanding of how to regulate AI, what we need to do first is to understand the impact of specific use cases of AI, because AI is rapidly emerging very much as a general purpose digital technology, which means it is used for all manners of things. From if we look at the example of the same technology, such as sentiment analysis, it's used to look at, by corporations, for instance, to look at reviews of their products. On the other hand, it is also used by law enforcement agencies to look at content online and how that can be used to inform predictive policing. It's the same technology, but very, very dramatically different use cases. So the thing that we must do is to understand the impact of the use case. And what we've created is a kind of a risk assessment framework where we evaluate the likelihood of harm as well as the severity of harm. Some cases are high likelihood, high severity, often scenarios where the state is involved. So, things like predictive policing, predicting of school dropouts, for instance. There are other situations which are low likelihood but high severity. So failures in, for instance, ID system is often considered low likelihood, but the cost is extremely high. High likelihood, low severity would mean a lot of cases which may not be directly impacting civil liberties or socioeconomic rights, but have a high failure rate. And then finally, there is low likelihood, low severity. This is perhaps the safest form of technology. And then our regulatory strategy to deal with each of these different situations will have to vary. And what we've done is we've created across parameters such as agency, quality, non-discrimination, safety, human impact, accountability, privacy, data protection. Along these parameters, we've framed clear questions that a regulator could ask themselves, or a civil society actor or researcher could ask of regulatory measures to see how they approach the question of regulation. And to just sort of illustrate how they might work, one very key example is the question of mandatory versus voluntary. So things which are mandated, such as adoption of predictive policing software, or adoption of digital ID technology, these are by their very nature mandatory and have consequently higher impact. On the other hand, if you use AI in agriculture, often the implementation might be optional for farmers, and they can themselves look at the pros and cons of adopting a technology. Then another key question is whether human behavior is being modeled. So in most cases where personal data is involved of any kind, whether in its individualized form or in its anonymized or aggregate form, most often the result of that analysis and AI processing would be to model human behavior. But then there could also be other use cases such as analysis of geographical data or climate data, which doesn't necessarily lead to modeling of human behavior. Again, equality and non-discrimination is something that we feel is very much at the center of an Afro-feminist approach to AI governance. And, in high-impact sectors such as law enforcement, financial services, we have advocated the use of regulatory innovation such as equality duty that has been adopted to some extent in the UK, for instance. And finally, there is the question of safety and human impact, where again, there are other sectoral regulations which already might be governing safety. And then as we see more and more adoption of automated technologies in those sectors, we might have to revisit the form of those regulations. We've created a kind of flowchart as thresholds for regulation, which can be an easily digestible form of how to apply this framework. And then the final point that I would make is with regard to the idea of data exploitation and how we need to look at modes of regulation that confront data exploitation and allow for actors who might not necessarily have a network advantage or might not have an existing market advantage to also flourish. We've created some design principles which can inform this process. So the principle of participation, the principle of inclusivity in procurement. Often when we're talking about the deployment of technology by the nation state, by governments and regulators, then it must be dealt with at the level of procurement itself. And finally, the constant need for gender impact assessment as a way of critically looking at policies, programs, and services. So that's a very, very brief overview of the principles framework that we've come up with, as well as the handbook for regulation of AI through an Afro-feminist approach. With that, I'm going to pause and I will let our esteemed discussants come in. We've shared copies of the report in advance with them, and we very much look forward to their insights, comments, criticisms, and feedback.
Okay, thank you very much, Amber. I think in the interest of time, we'll move right to our panelists. And we'll start with Bridget Boache. She's going to be our first panelist. Just to say, this feels like a 360 moment, Bridget and Kito, because we were with you at the very start of this project, the IGF in Addis Ababa last year. And so it's really great to have you be a part of us again here as a panelist. Bridget Boache is a senior policy advisor, science and tech at the Tony Blair Institute. And she's just doing a lot of just really brilliant work in the space. You can look it up and you'll find all of it online, her publications, etc. Bridget, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Bobina. That's a very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And it is wonderful to be back with the policy team, as you rightly mentioned. I think we have been in conversation over AI policy for a while. So it's definitely a full circle moment for me as well. So I'll start off with a little bit about TBI, Tony Blair Institute, for those who may not know of the organization. We're a global nonprofit, and basically what we do is we advise governments on how to create and make their countries more open and prosperous for all their citizens. So the idea of Afrofeminism is something that we're especially interested in, because I think it advances our main objective, which is inclusion and openness and prosperity. We also believe that technology is a central political question of our time, and especially AI. We don't think you can decouple technology from politics at this time, given, I think, its prominence in our daily lives, its prominence in governance as well. So I think, as has been already mentioned, we also believe that there's an opportunity to think about how AI can enable us to address some of the challenges that are on the continent. But we also think very critically about how do we regulate it to minimize its harms, and how do we foster greater global cooperation and collaboration. I specifically sit in our science and tech team, so I'm a bit on the sort of advisory side. I'm on the policy think tank side, let me say, where I sit more on the research side, thinking about policy, thinking about strategies. And I have colleagues who are advisors, government advisors, embedded in government ministries and tech and elsewhere, who are really thinking about, how do we take the policies that we're developing into practice with governments. So this, again, is something that AI is something that we've been thinking about for some time. I wanted to mention some of the work that we've done on African women in AI, because I think it positions me to comment on, I see a hand raised. I don't know if we should take it or if folks want to put this into the comment. We've worked with Research ICT Africa on its, I did a workshop on its feminism and AI. On feminism and AI, specifically on its global responsible AI index, where feminism and the global South feature heavily. Our advisors also helped Senegal get into GPay, given the limited presence of Africa in the global sort of AI governance space, as has already been mentioned. And lastly, we hosted an African Women in AI Summit, where we brought together policymakers, academics, civil society, over 200 people in Accra, Ghana, to really center the story of African women, and to celebrate the accomplishments, especially of African policymakers who have been at the forefront of developing AI strategies and ethical frameworks on the continent. So with that context, I know we're all short on time, so I want to quickly jump into my sort of take from Pollicy's paper on VELAI. I thought it was brilliant, and kudos to Bobina, Amber, Keto, Irene, etc. on this really wonderful work. I think, as Amber rightly shared, there's a global conversation on AI governance frameworks. And the framework comes at a time when I think governments around the world want resources on how to develop frameworks for their own local context. So I think it's very timely. I also think it supports some of the work that has been done by Research Africa and others on the Global AI Responsible Index, because we can't really change what we don't measure, right? So we have the framework, and the complement of the index help us to measure sort of progress on feminism and the values that we care about around responsible AI. I really appreciated the use of the use cases, because I think it makes it evident for the work that I do to take it to advisors, to take it to their government counterparts, and advising them on why such a framework is important. And I also really appreciated that the paper and also the framework goes beyond harm to thinking about emancipatory and participatory AI. I think mostly in the global north, a lot of the time, the discussion on responsible AI sort of is limited to harm, as opposed to advancing beyond what sort of emancipation and sort of freedom can really look like in this space. So thank you so much for this wonderful work. I on the policy framework and the regulatory practices, I think this idea of a risk-based approach is probably prominent, as we've seen in the EU's AI risk-based approach, in the EU's AI Act and its risk-based approach, right? But I think this framework takes it a bit further. We're attributing equal responsibility across the power stakeholders, but also requiring that they take into account the perspectives and the voices of sort of everyone in a multi-stakeholder approach in a way that's really participatory. And I think there's a real discussion on how this could work. And I really appreciated how practical the policy framework was. I think, the discussion on self-regulation, co-regulation, and regulation are really important, right? Especially for the Africa context. We know self-regulation can be insufficient, global north or in Africa. We know that sometimes regulation in the Africa context, especially for governments, can take sort of an approach that further compounds on the harm. Some of the things we've talked about in some of our papers are social media taxes, internet bans, et cetera, that can further impinge on individual rights. And we also know the challenge with co-regulation. And I believe in 2020, there was a case of Uganda's government sort of requiring YouTube to take away some sort of political YouTube content, and Google basically challenged the Ugandan government. So that can be, co-regulation can also be a challenge, but I think there's a place where policy presents an opportunity for either of the three, right? So how do we support governments in thinking through when each is appropriate? Because it may not work in the ways that governments have been using them so far. I'll just probably end here with some comments on opportunities for embedding these principles, because again, I think they're really brilliant and timely. I think one of the places that we can look to embed these Afro-feminist ideas would be in regulatory sandboxes that are being sort of piloted across the continent. I know Ghana, Rwanda, others have regulatory sandboxes, and that can be a place to test whether some of these AI applications really stand up to some of the principles that we care about in the Afro-feminist perspective. I also think a number of countries are developing ethical AI frameworks. And that's a place, again, where I believe the discussion earlier from our government counterparts suggests that this is a place where they would be looking for inspiration. And that's why this framework is really timely and could be used in that regard. I think African governments, from our research, are really interested in developing AI strategies. Some of our advisors have come to us with governments who are thinking about this. And usually they're thinking about it from the perspective of advance and adoption, but we think it could be a good place to also talk about governance and to forward some of these principles. And fourth, I think co-regulation, we can think about co-regulation beyond industry, specifically the role of education and African institutions, universities and boot camps as a place to embed and again embody some of these principles. I say this because last month I was in Ghana for the Deep Learning and Daba Summit, which is sort of the coming together community of African AI developers, around 800 people. And these are the practitioners, these are the people who are really developing the applications. And I think when we think about industry in Africa, industries at the moment are really in universities, are really in the boot camps, because there are at the moment the de facto labs, AI labs on the continent. So how can we get some of these principles embedded in the educational curricula or in some of these institutions? I think the challenge that we would face with the Afro-feminist principle would be, our research suggests that data, sort of some of these principles are in place. When you look at the data protection strategies or principles across the continent, there's this idea of transparency. We've talked about privacy, et cetera. But especially during COVID, there were a number of reports that suggested that compliance is really difficult, given some of the funding challenges of these data protection commissions, some of their limitations and power. So I think in the places where some of these principles do exist, our real challenge is how do we strengthen the compliance mechanisms on the continent. And then I'll close with two things that I would propose for future thinking around this Afrofeminist framework and the regulatory practices. One is, as I finished reading both papers, I thought, in the absence of the regulatory infrastructure on the continent, I know there's a real discussion of techno solutionism in the paper, which is really important. But in the absence of regulatory infrastructure in a place like Africa, how do we incentivize the building of Afrofeminist technologies that are either a model for the AI technologies that are being imported into countries or that are being built in the country? Or how do we incentivize Afrofeminist AI tech that can be used to evaluate some of these principles that we care about in AI systems? I say this because we're doing some work around peace tech, and the development space is really sort of, it's looking to advance on technology and embed in AI. And we thought peace tech might be an opportunity, again, to think about where their regulatory infrastructure, not as a replacement, but as a complement, and especially to support the work that organizations such as yourself are doing. When I was in Accra again for deep learning in Daba, a lot of the young people were curious as to how they can use their skills to address some of the questions that we care about in policy around responsible AI, around some of these governance frameworks. And I think getting developers on board to help us address these questions, not in a techno-solutionist way. Again, let me stress, I'm not advocating that at all, but in a way that is productive and that empowers us to build our own systems to advance the solutions that we care about. And the second thing I'll put as a future sort of consideration within the Afrofeminist framework is I would love a discussion on the role of the AU. How do we get the AU to champion this campaign of an Afrofeminist AI through its continental AI strategy, which is being developed, and as was mentioned in the paper, through the working group on AI? Because as was previously mentioned, right, AI is a cross-cutting technology, it crosses borders, it has no respect for some of the boundaries that we're thinking around, like country level regulation. And a continental approach that's harmonized would allow us to have more, I think, bargaining power on some of the international governance protocols and international governance frameworks. So how do we sort of empower the AU, which is already stated actually in its working paper from Egypt, that they want to embed African values, they want to embed African principles in an African AI strategy. How do we support them in embedding these principles in the continental AI strategy, and also in canvassing this for international protocols on which, again, we should continue to push for more African deliberation and more African voices. So I'll end here with a final note on some of our upcoming work. We're doing a lot of work on AI geopolitics, especially ahead of the UK AI Summit, given we have a strong UK arm. So how do we sort of encourage countries such as the UK who want to lead on global AI governance to bring in more players, especially from the global South and especially from Africa. And secondly, we will have an upcoming report on compute, which is probably going to be our biggest work this year. And sadly, we already have a digital divide, but we see another one opening up on AI compute, specifically the hardware and software required to enable AI systems. There's another divide, sadly, opening up there, and where our report seeks to get ahead of it. How do we support African and other countries in the global South and elsewhere? Actually, it's not, the compute divide is not only along the global South, but how do we support all countries in being in a level field where they can use compute resources meaningfully to develop responsible AI systems that they care about, and also to use it to assess the AI technologies that are being developed in their countries or that are being brought in. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to questions and comments and the deliberation. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share once again, Pollicy. Over to you, Bobina.
Okay, thank you very much, Bridget. As always, you always have very profound sharings. You've I think there is a lot to think about, from some of the things you shared, for example, with the, some of the ways forward that we could think about. So, for example, engaging the AU with this, I think we've tried to, we do have some deliberations with the ACHPR. And so I guess that's a line along which we can try to see how to embed some of this. But also, I think something you bring up that's very important is the growing of Afro-feminist AI technologies. I think that's something very important, and I don't think it's techno-solutionist in any way. I think it's important for us, like you mentioned. I think, yes, industry is very much within academia at the moment. I think that's where a lot of development is happening, and so I think there would be all the good in supporting the people in there that are bringing these, these solutions that could address a lot of the policy issues that we're talking about. But really, really interesting sharing. And, thank you for a lot of your remarks, like when you talk about how the work could support your work with the use cases and how that works to, for example, break this down to the policymakers in understanding, the regulatory scope, et cetera, just thank you very much for your sharing, Bridget. We will move forward to our next panelist, who is Kito. Christofina Shilongo is a senior tech policy fellow at the Mozilla Foundation, was with us as well at the very inception of this, and is someone I have greatly consulted through and through as I've been working on this, and it's a great pleasure to have you be a part of us, Kito. You're welcome.
Thank you, Bobina, and thank you very much. I share the same sentiment as Bridget. Thank you very much for inviting me to read your work and review it, and I'm a big fan of Pollicy's work. I don't think that's a secret, and I really thoroughly enjoyed reading the handbook as well as the report. And so just a few comments that I have on the report. I really appreciate the use of Afrofeminism and the introduction of it as a principle to underline regulatory frameworks, but also our understanding of the issues around AI and data. And just to, Bobina already mentioned this, just to highlight, for me, really, Afrofeminism, based on the report, prompts us to investigate the underlying disparities, power disparities behind AI and the making of AI technologies, data and the making of AI technologies, as well as the resulting practices such as labor exploitation. But also, secondly, I don't know, for me, it allowed me, I imagine that people reading it will pause and be able to ask who is visible and who is not. And I mentioned this, one of the things that you want to achieve with this report. And so, it's I think a pause to ask who is visible and who is not, and also for us to look at who are the people who benefit, and what do we view or define as benefits. It also the concept of Afrofeminism also allows us to question the normative practices and narratives around regulation of data, of AI, but regulation in general. And I think this, it was mentioned earlier, that regulation negatively impacts innovation. Where does that come from? For me, immediately when I read your section on co-regulation and self-regulation, I can imagine and I can trace back that this narrative of regulation negatively impacts innovation might have been, might come from instances where people who are testing ideas, so self-regulation, pushing this notion of it's stifling our innovation, where I think it's the contrary is actually true, or the opposite is actually true, that regulation enables responsible, trustworthy innovation. I think it also, for me, the concept itself allowed or will allow people to recognize that exclusion and oppression is institutionalized, and it's fluid. It's not, these institutions that are used to oppress or exclude are not just, what is the word? They're not, they're not ever, they change. And so they are, fluid. And so regulations to respond to the, to these, this institutionalized, fluid ways of oppression and exclusionary. For me, one of the highlights of the book and what I really appreciate was this notion of harmonizing collective and individual rights, data rights. Amber mentioned it. I think the dominant approaches to data so far has been very individualistic. They have reduced privacy to anonymity. And so I think we should be looking at an approach that expands beyond like just the individual, but looking at the collective, but also bringing these two together. Also allowing us to like explore the philosophical like frameworks that are existent, Ubuntu and others have mentioned. Very key, and I loved that you included this like making the invisible or making invisible workers visible. Highlighting the need for regulation that recognizes that that these workers need protection, that they are people. Despite the fact that there's automation, there are people working behind this automation. We've seen that in Kenya, and you mentioned that in the report. And also just like it prompts us to expand, the benefits of AI and data beyond the economic, because being visible doesn't mean being visible means that you humanize the people, you humanize the people behind this, and being human is more nuanced than just a GDP measurement. And I like the idea of understanding impact. And I think understanding impact will inform the modes of regulation, as you mentioned in the report. And I really, really, really hope that people will make use of the impact threshold that you have included in the manual or the handbook. For me, when I read it, I thought, okay, how is this useful right now? I see it as an orientation, like as a first like step for people who are understanding. I think it would also be useful as an orientation manual for when people come, international supporters or collaborators. I think there's this omission of like, minority groups, exclusion of women. I think it brings those people to the forefront and brings like issues that are often neglected or often like, pushed to the back into the forefront. And so, Bridget also mentioned, I think it might also be useful for builders of tech as well to understand what are these like social economic issues that are removed from the technical issues that they are so often used to working with. And I think as well, I know of a few countries in Southern Africa as well as East Africa who are conducting assessments to see the preparedness of their regulatory frameworks and institutions in the adoption and deployment of AI. And so I think this is a timely moment for this report. And you did speak about capacity, and I think in using this manual, you'll be able to like, or countries will be able to like see what capacities are needed, especially in when I look at the impact assessment or understanding the impact. And this idea of making a distinction between mandatory and voluntary regulation, I think is also very, this report might be useful for that. And I think if we go back, I know a few years ago, everyone was talking about the UN's 2030 agenda to leave no one behind. And I think leaving no one behind will require mandatory regulation. It cannot be voluntary. I think, there has been a lot of oppressive practices, and there's a lot of, we can see that, a lot of time institutions that we build, even now that are automated, they perpetuate like existing inequalities and inequalities. For me, two questions or two observations came to mind when I was reading especially the handbook. I really appreciate problematizing datafication. And I think that will allow us to identify the new forms of value that are created within our industries and also within institutions, and also for us to recognize that there is an institutional shift happening right now. And so policies cannot be the same as they were 30 years ago. Workers, our labor laws cannot be the same as how they were, to address labor challenges a few years ago. Our perspectives on consent, on privacy, on meaningful participation has to change to in recognition of this institutional shift. And so, I really appreciate this calling for a nuanced understanding of community and the collective. However, last week or a few weeks ago, I attended a conversation hosted by Connected by Data. I saw Tim Davis was on the call earlier, and one of the participants asked a very interesting question about how to approach instances where harm is caused to non-data subjects. How do we approach those instances? And the conversation was about collective rights and collective organizing. And the question that was raised is, who gets to define the collective, and how do we define the collective? I think addressing those questions would allow us to not circle back into this oppressive system where a collective majority could oppress or suppress the rights of a minority that is not represented. And so, who represents this collective if they are a minority, and who gets to speak? And I think that's where this notion of Afrofeminism comes in, and I appreciate it, but it's also a question that maybe it's not even a direct question, but maybe a rhetorical question of continually, coming back to this manual and to this report and asking ourselves, who is represented and who gets to speak? It's often women right now, and mostly African women. And so, and really the point that they made was that, collective data rights are exclusionary by design. Whereas the opposite for individual rights, they really, they protect the human right. I mean, the human. What is the Afrofeminist approach to this? How do we avoid this, notion of an in-group or an out-group, and a group that could be, a majority or a collective, seen as a collective, but has power? And how can we empower those out-groups that might not have enough power or institutional resources and backing? And how can that be incorporated into regulatory frameworks? So that's just my little synopsis of the report. So thank you very much for your work. For me, it's very useful. I'm working right now on a project on participatory governance, where I'm, critically looking at participation and how that can be incorporated into regulation. And I think this having it being underlined by this notion of Afro-feminist AI is quite useful, and it expands to expanding this notion of benefits beyond economic benefits, speaks to what issues of environmental degradation, what are the impacts of AI on existing needs like energy, food, and how are we prioritizing them against this drive for this digital transformation. So yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Kito. I think you just bring a very keen eye, and you've just helped very critically unpack a lot of the issues that are explored in both reports. So for example, just going over the issue of the collective and how that is defined, I think those are just some interesting things to think about, even for us. How's the in-group and out-group, how's the voices of the out-group brought in, so to speak, Also, when you bring up, the issue of visibility and how this could go beyond, the understanding of the economic and just the human as more nuanced. I think all these are just things to think about broadly, and that I hope any reader would be inspired to think about like that as they go over the report. Just really a number of issues, and who's this for, and the applicability of the report. Again, something Bridget brought up as well. I think these are things that I'm glad that these are your initial reflections on reading the report, and really, really interesting to hear all of that. I think just in the interest of time, we'll move over to our, I think, closing speaker, who is Gillian Dowie. So Gillian has been I'd say, just in very just simple terms, just a big support system to us throughout the project. But she's the senior program specialist at the IDRC, the International Development Research Center, and has been our support throughout the project. And Gillian, thank you very much for being present, for your feedback, for your insights through and through. And we really, I'm looking forward very much to hear your overall reflections with this, but in relation to the larger AI4D program and IDRC's vision with the project as a whole. You're welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Bobina, and thanks for the presentation. This was really excellent to see you and Umbera work through it and talk about it with this community. I could probably just say I agree with Bridget and Kito on everything they said, and then just stop. But I'll say a little bit more than that. I think that this is a super useful tool. I mean, going through it and having a look at the draft earlier and seeing it, this is just an incredibly useful, handbook for policymakers or for anybody involved in the governance of AI tools being used in the region. That includes, developers, educators, civil society organizations, communities who need a say in how tech shapes their daily lives. I think I'll start by telling you a little bit about AI4D, just to give a sense of the bigger picture where we supported this work through and where we see it fitting well. AI4D is essentially a shorthand for Artificial Intelligence for Development Africa. It's a program that's based on the premise that AI, and specifically responsible AI, could be a tool that unlocks new solutions to pressing social and economic challenges. I think we all agree on that. But of course, that it could also have an outsized role on people's lives without their involvement or without their consent, and that it could be used in ways that deepen inequality, enhance divisions between people, or is generally used in ways that just don't promote any form of a public good. IDRC is a research organization, and in this program, we're working with Swedish SIDA's research team. So we're supporting multidisciplinary groups of researchers, developers, activists, and thought leaders across the region to build out an AI ecosystem that puts questions of inclusion at the core of their solutions and that promote the design and use of AI for positive impact across sectors. And we do that by supporting, policy and regulatory research, which is where this clearly fits, by supporting sectoral and domain-specific innovation networks that build responsible AI solutions, one of which is focused entirely on gender and inclusion. And we also do that by supporting efforts to build the talent pipeline. One of the things we support is the Global Index on Responsible AI that Bridget mentioned earlier, and we see the use of these tools actually in tandem. And I know that Research ICT Africa, who's leading that, was part of sort of conceptualizing this work as well. So it's really great to see these kinds of connections across all of the institutions involved in AI4D being built. A big sort of push, I guess, in AI4D, as well as in other work that we do in other regions through a group called the Feminist AI Research Network, is to put questions of gender and inclusion and community use into the center of the entire AI conversation. How can AI governance and regulation be designed to protect people and to actually enhance inclusion and visibility of women, people with disabilities, migrants, or others who are invisible in the data? How can innovations ask the right questions from the outset to be built inclusively and align with principles like community consultations, rights respecting, and so on? And how can the pipeline of talent be more equitably distributed? And how can data systems be debiased and on, right? This Afro-feminist handbook and the guidance for policymakers are really critical ways to do that, to define what an AI framework for the region looks like and what governance of AI looks like in context. Not only is this an essential tool that we'll share with all of the organizations involved with AI4D. We support a lot of sort of innovations. We support policy research. All of these groups are going to benefit from this. Already have, I believe, seen a presentation a few months back of it, and now we're gonna do a little bit more to put that out there. But we hope that this provides really meaningful guidance to policymakers on what key considerations they need to make when regulating AI or assessing an AI tool for use in service delivery. This will hopefully equip them with the questions they should be asking, an understanding of how to assess the possible impact. One thing that we've come to understand, and I think all of you probably understand, through consultations with leaders of all the different AI4D projects and scoping work and other research in the region, is the lack of preparedness on the policy side for understanding and regulating AI. There's definitely a sense that it could be an exciting way to solve challenges. For example, designing social protection schemes or improving access to healthcare in rural areas. These are really practical spaces where I think there's a lot of interest. But without that deeper understanding of the gaps in data, or the implications of privacy or data rights or consent, and how this and so much more feeds into biased tools, there's a lot of risk of the misuse of AI, especially when we're talking about actual government decision making and resource allocation. The kind of hyped up interest in AI after ChatGPT came out last year actually intensifies this lack of readiness in policy communities. And this is true everywhere. The technology is faster than people, and bureaucratic and institutional kind of inertia or speed of change leaves a lot of governments and decision makers in the dark about what to do. The Canadian federal government actually just released guidance on using generative AI in for public servants in their jobs, and that was weeks. It was almost a year after ChatGPT came out that kind of information was made available. I believe there are close to 5 countries now with AI strategies in sub-Saharan Africa, and I might be wrong about that, but a growing number are coming out and publishing strategies, and the AU, as everybody's mentioned, will be coming out with one soon as well. But even then, it isn't clear where Afro-feminist principles have fit in, or whether decision makers are equipped to interpret guidance. There hasn't been enough time to even get AI experts on board in governments, except ministries that do have a direct tech mandate, who are a bit more prepared for this kind of transition. And that's where I think this is so critical, a tool to help people think through, what's behind the AI, what data are they using, who's missing, what values underpin it or not, and what's the potential impact. That kind of really clear guidance, I think, is so helpful to think through these tools. And this is the kind of guidance that should become, to me, the status quo in AI development and regulation, to help everyone understand both to what extent AI is serving the public good and whether AI is appropriate as a tool in a given situation. And importantly, that this be based on region-specific experience and expertise, given the unique history, the unique mix of cultures. As Bobina mentioned earlier as well, global frameworks are being created, but they aren't always well suited to every context, or they don't represent key values in every context, or are not always even written with adequate consultation or nuanced understandings of different contexts. This tool gets at creating a vision for AI that centers African expertise, that doesn't or aims to prevent the replication of problematic power structures that these tools are often carry forward, are often made to carry forward because they're based in data and assumptions that don't reflect the kind of work that you're trying to do, the kinds of questions that you're asking, the values that underpin this framework. So for that, we're very happy to have supported it. This is a super exciting tool. We definitely see it as incredibly useful within the network, and we hope that everybody here can amplify this to those who need it for decision making and AI development, and that this is something that's going to be really widely used and in demand as we're getting into the growth of AI in our day-to-day lives, in our governance and decision making and so on. So thank you so much for this presentation. This is exciting work, and looking forward to continuing to engage around this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you for sharing. I think just very quickly, I think you do expound the need for us to just have a background understanding of just everything as we get into regulation, especially for the policymakers, but also for civil society and technologists as well. And I think this points very much to what Kito, I think, very aptly called this working as an orientation support tool of sorts. And I totally agree. Thank you very much to you all. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Kito. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Amber. And the rest of our attendees. Thank you very, very, very much for being a part of us. And we'll be very much looking forward to your feedback. Once you've read the report will be shared right after this, right after we're done here. But we're supposed to be finishing within the next few minutes. I do want to allow for just some questions. Please feel free to ask away, whether it's to a particular panelist or any of the persons who spoke. You can put your question in the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask directly. We'll take a few minutes to do that, and then we will wrap this up because we're supposed to finish at 5 p.m. But we're just a few minutes away from 5 p.m. So we'll be taking questions. But you can help with that as well if there's some questions I missed in the chat. Please, thank you.
I think there's a question from Florence in the chat. Should I go ahead and answer that?
Yes, I see it. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the question, Florence. I think this the question on the African principles is certainly important. And my comment, if I recall, was that the African Union AI Working Group is looking to embed African values in the continental AI strategy. And that's from some of the research we've done on what's going on around the working group, as well as from some of our advisors who have more visibility into that. Apologies, my daughter is here with me at the moment. So the question was, have we identified these African strategies? I think there's still a question on that. I think overall, as you see in the Pollicy report, there's this overarching idea that African values can be sort of summarized under the idea of Ubuntu, where we generally prize communal interest over individual or self-interest. I definitely take that across Africa. There are nuances. I don't in any way mean to suggest we're a monolith, but I think generally that's the idea that I see sort of regional frameworks shaping around this idea of communal interest. I believe I was at a workshop where there was some discussion around, does Ubuntu cut across, let's say, Southern to Western Africa, Northern Africa, etc. While I think I might have to write my response and share in an email, but while I think there are nuances, I think generally across the continent, those communal values will be something we're working towards. But other principles I think are yet to be decided upon. They're general sort of global principles we have from the OECD, from other sort of ethical AI frameworks. The African principles I think are still being sort of talked under with this working group on AI, and I think the framework that Pollicy has put forth will be something that can be used in some of these discussions as well. But I'll stop here so that the chatter in my background can also end. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Do we have any other questions, colleagues? Okay, seems not. It seems we don't have any other questions, and so we can wrap it up. It's 5 p.m. and we're supposed to finish at 5 p.m. So we are right on time. And just to reiterate again that we're so grateful for everyone joining us for this conversation as Pollicy. We're very much looking forward to continue engaging on a number of issues that we're exploring in the reports. Feel free to reach out to myself or Amber or anyone else for that matter on the team for just further engagements on any and everything within the handbook and VELAI. And yeah, I think that's it from me. Have a good day. Thank you very much all. I think we can wrap this up. Thank you. And good to meet you all. I've been reading the chat, and thank you very much for making the time to come be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Bobina.
you.
And see you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.